The Honourable Member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising tonight to follow up on a question I asked in the House on March 21st regarding funding for services for Canadians with print disabilities. CELA, the Centre for Equitable Library Access, and NNELS, the National Network for Equitable Library Services, are national not-for-profit organizations that provide accessible reading services to people with print disabilities in Canada. In the fall economic update, the Liberal government announced their decision to cut $4 million in essential funding for them. Cuts to these organizations would have severely impacted their ability to produce and distribute accessible reading materials and would have resulted in reduced accessibility for persons with disabilities across Canada. Fortunately, because of NNELS and CELA's advocacy campaign, as well as the work of so many disability advocates from across the country making their voices heard, the government was forced to reverse the proposed funding cut in support to Canadians with disabilities. In response to NNELS and CELA's advocacy campaign to restore the funding, the federal government announced on March 16th that they would provide an additional $1 million for this coming year. This additional $1 million, Mr. Speaker, is really the amount that reinstates funding for NNELS and CELA to the same levels as previous years. However, the government also made it clear that the reinstatement of funds was because the pandemic has affected the timeline, and it made no provision to ensure that funding cuts would not proceed as planned starting in 2022-23. My office reached out to CELA and NNELS, and they provided an important overview on the situation they are facing. I want to say thank you to Kevin Millsap and Laurie Davidson for their advocacy and work on this issue, and for providing excellent resources. In the most recent budget, there is no provision for long-term sustainable funding for NNELS and CELA. Though the federal government announced that there would be no funding cuts for this coming year, for 21-22, as it stands right now, starting in 22-23, NNELS and CELA will be facing a 50% cut in funding and then declining to $0 by 2024-25. The current funding envelope is small, only $4 million a year, but the impact of this funding is significant, and the loss of NNELS and CELA services to people with print disabilities in Canada will be devastating. CELA and NNELS work to ensure books and other library materials are accessible across multiple formats for Canadians with print disabilities. People with print disabilities include those who are blind or low vision, those who have physical disabilities that impact a person's ability to read or manipulate a physical book, and those who have learning or cognitive disabilities such as dyslexia. This funding enables seniors and persons with disabilities to have access to public library materials. This is even more critical in rural Canada, where access and resources are limited. In fact, CELA estimates 1 in every 10 Canadians need accessible formatting for reading materials, proving the essential nature of this partnership. Further, it is expected this number will only increase with a growing senior population across the country. One library in my riding offered the following remarks regarding CELA services. The number of users and inquiries have risen noticeably in the past year, and with the aging baby boomers and the general older population of Grey Bruce, we are bound to see an increase in the number of users. Hopefully, funding will continue for this important services. I'd like to talk briefly about my own 98, soon-to-be 99-year-old grandmother. I just got her an audio book, Mr. Speaker, in January. Within a couple of weeks, she had already gone through 9 books. She's loving this audiobook to the point that she's no longer even socially active in her long-term care home because she loves it. It's giving her a sense of life, and you can hear the joy in her voice. Mr. Speaker, I just want a clear answer from the government. Will the government commit to providing long-term, stable federal funding for CELA and NNELS to ensure that equitable reading services will continue to be made available to people with print disabilities in Canada? Thank you.
The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member from Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound for his question. His advocacy is making a difference in the lives of his constituents. Our government is committed to the principle that everyone should be able to access information and reading material. And that's why we signed on to the Marrakesh Treaty 4 years ago, and at the same time set up a working group comprised of disability groups, including CELA and NNELS, and the publishing industry to develop a long-term strategy on the production of alternate format materials in Canada. We recognize that alternate format materials are more important than ever for persons with print disabilities. They allow persons with print disabilities to read, to learn, and to fully participate in society. Moreover, they are critical during the pandemic. People need up-to-date information, directives, and guidelines related to their health and safety in alternate formats. Many Canadians have also been asked to stay home as much as possible in order to flatten the curve. They have felt isolated and have relied heavily on accessible books and materials to help cope. One of the first organizations I heard from about this issue was the Windsor Public Library, a champion for accessible reading in my community of Windsor-Tecumseh. Mr. Speaker, we continue to listen to the disability community and to organizations like the Windsor Public Library about the importance of CELA and NNELS. And that is why our government announced an additional $1 million on March 16th to support activities related to the production of alternate format materials carried out by the Center for Equitable Library Access and the National Network for Equitable Library Service, or CELA and NNELS for short. The funding provided through the Social Development Partnership Program, disability component, recognizes that the pandemic has been hard on persons with disabilities. It has also delayed the publishing industry in its goal of making significant progress to ensure books are born accessible in Canada. And as a result, the additional $1 million will help CELA and NNELS provide more accessible reading materials to persons with print disabilities in Canada. This investment adds to the $10 million for CELA and NNELS that was already announced in the 2020 Fall Economic Statement. Mr. Speaker, the Fall Economic Statement provided for the first time stable, predictable, multi-year funding for the not-for-profit sector in this area. It adds to the $22.8 million in funding announced in Budget 2019 for a transition strategy that supports moving the production of alternate format books from the not-for-profit sector to the Canadian independent publishing industry. This money is helping independent publishers to create alternate format books and to get to a point when they are able to do so independently. In fact, in 2017, we set up a working group on alternate format materials with representatives from disability organizations and the Canadian publishing industry, including CELA and NNELS. And based on the recommendations, we developed the transition strategy. But Mr. Speaker, we're still in a pandemic, and it is causing challenges for the not-for-profit and publishing sectors. And that's the reality. The Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion recently met with CELA and NNELS, and we understand there is a need to keep engaging with publishers and to possibly reevaluate the transitional timeline. We will not leave people high and dry without accessible information during a pandemic. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bruce-Grey-Owen Sound.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my thanks to the parliamentary secretary for committing and I appreciate the government having a long-term strategy. But I think the most important comment that he made was the fact that they are willing to evaluate the strategy going forward. Because bottom line, I can understand how they want to move these costs over to the publishing network and make it more self-sustaining. That makes perfect sense. But what I want the government to commit, and will they commit, to continuing to work with CELA and NNELS and all these other organizations to ensure that long-term funding stays there and it doesn't end up with a reduction in funding or support for these critical industries and critical capabilities for our disabled. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, our announcement of $1 million for CELA and NNELS is in line with our commitment to the Marrakesh Treaty. It adds to previous new investments from Budget 2019 and the Fall Economic Statement. And our support will enable access to alternate format materials such as Braille, ebooks, and audiobooks during the pandemic. In fact, this funding will help increase the overall volume of accessible print material available for Canadians with print disabilities. It will also support Canadians with print disabilities to familiarize themselves and get comfortable with using new digital tools. I would like to thank again the member for his question and for his tremendous advocacy on behalf of his constituents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
La motion portant que le